Good morning. It's nice to see you. How you doing? We have really a tricky thing to do this morning. We have to talk about the Lord's Prayer. But there's so many angles we could take on it that, well, let's see what we can do with just prayer at first. So here's the outline. Here's what we're going to do. We're just going to briefly talk about a man named George Herbert who wrote a poem about prayer. And then we're going to talk about the Lord's Prayer. But before we do anything, let's also follow up on last week where I said prayer is supposed to be somewhat secret. It's supposed to be a little private. But that's because it's supposed to be an outpouring from you, your own personal self. And we're going to kind of address that in this video. Now, a lot of us have some preconceived ideas about what prayer is and what prayer is not. And that can cause problems sometimes. Because let's say we were given a very shallow understanding of prayer, or maybe we've actually received a shallow understanding from Hollywood about what prayer is. And there's actually whole schools of thought. But in the Christian tradition, there's actually two ways of talking about faith and theology. And these are going to be really big words, but it's just cataphatic is one, apophatic is the other. And that means according to what can be said and according to what is not able to be explained in words, what can't be said. And so in Christianity, we tend to emphasize, at least in Western Christianity, if we're being honest, we tend to emphasize what we can say, not always realizing that we've got to balance that with the mystery about the parts of God that can't be described with words. And prayer is somewhat like that. Prayer is one of those things where it's like if you talk about it too much, you've kind of diminished it. You have to leave a little bit of space for mystery around it. And that's one of the ways that we can maybe have some overflow or preconceived ideas. Sometimes if we don't understand the mystery enough, prayer becomes fake. It becomes weird. It becomes something else. But George Herbert, I have a copy of some of his poems right here. And this is a great volume, but he wrote a poem that's really just a list of ways of describing what prayer is. And it's obviously it's poetic, but what I would like to do is read it real quick, and you just listen for one phrase that you like, that you feel like summarizes prayer for you. Does it make sense? So this is called Prayer 1 because he has 3 poems called Prayer. Here we go. Prayer, the church's banquet, angels' age, God's breath in man returning to his birth. That's interesting. The soul in paraphrase, heart in pilgrimage, the Christian plummet sounding heaven and earth. Engine against the Almighty. Oh, sinner's tower. Reversed thunder. That's a cool one for prayer. Christ side-piercing spear. That with your prayer, you're piercing God. 6 days world transposing in an hour. A kind of tune which all things hear and fear. Softness and peace and joy and love and bliss. Exalted manna. Gladness of the best. Heaven in ordinary. Man well dressed. The Milky Way. That's what he thinks prayer might be. The bird of paradise. That's interesting. Church bells beyond the stars heard. The soul's blood. Yes. The land of spices, something understood. So that right there is just a list of poetic ways of describing poetry. So which one stood out for you? For me, I really enjoy the soul in paraphrase. That sounds like a cool way of understanding prayer. The heart in pilgrimage. I mean, yeah, the heart is the main organ of the cardiovascular system, but in poetic sense, the core, the center of your being is in pilgrimage. I like that. Reversed thunder, I like that one too. And obviously, I already gave a response, the soul's blood. So really, prayer is supposed to be something very personal. It's supposed to be something very direct from the finite of us to the infinite of God. And that connection is something we talk about, but we also need to recognize there's a mystery about it. So what we have when we talk about the Lord's Prayer is we need to realize back in the day, people didn't need books on prayer because everybody just taught and talked about how to pray. And yet today, we kind of have to ask to be shown it. And in some sense, yes, we do have the book of Psalms, which is a whole list of prayers, but we don't really have in the Bible a how-to document of how to pray other than right here. Think about it. There's no, here's how to sit, here's where you should do it, here's what time of day. But here's a very explicit example where Jesus says, when you pray, pray like this. Now, I was talking earlier this week with Anika, and she brought up some really good comments about how the Lord's Prayer sometimes can feel like it's rote ritual. It just seems so dead and flat because most of us have it memorized, probably in the King James Version, and it just sounds hollow when too many people are saying it without any of their own lifeblood in the words. Does that make sense? And maybe you've even found yourself, like somebody else starts saying the Lord's Prayer and then you just kind of instinctively, is that the right word? Instinctually. You just say it along with it, and it doesn't mean anything to you because your mouth is just doing it. Well, Anika, you're right, and prayer should not be something like that. Prayer should hopefully be something that we do consciously. Now, here's one of the things we need to talk about before I break down the phrase, Our Father who art in heaven. When Jesus starts the Lord's Prayer, just before that, he says, when you pray, pray in this manner. But in other translations, it might say, pray like this. And so we've got something to ask. We've got an issue right there. Is the Lord's Prayer something we're supposed to say verbatim, or is it supposed to be a model that we kind of tweak? And I don't know what to say, so let's go through the pros and cons of each. All right. What's a pro of having a set prayer that we all say and the words are already prescribed for us from Jesus' own mouth? Okay. A pro could be maybe we don't know the words to pray, so we have our own words given to us. Okay. Maybe we're prone to only praying about particular things, and so it's good to have a prayer that highlights a number of different things in life. That's good. What's a con? A con of having a literal word-for-word prayer to follow is we can start to do it without thinking, like a reflex. And it doesn't mean anything. It's not soul's blood coming out, you know? So that might be a con. What would be a pro on the other side is, let's say it's a format to tweak a little bit, is that, well, we could put our own self into it just a little bit. And that each one of us might have a slightly different vocabulary, and that's perfect because it would be personal then. That's a good thing. But a negative could be that we diminish it, or maybe we overlook particular things. And so on both sides, there's pros and cons towards whether or not we should say the Lord's Prayer verbatim or use it as a model that we then write our own prayer. So let's at least talk about the first line, just Our Father who art in heaven, or who is in heaven. Well, let's do it word for word. Our. That would assume that it's a collective thing. When you pray, it shouldn't just be about you, but it is in the first person plural. So that means when you pray, make it personal, but remember it involves everyone. Now, let's go even one step further, right? The our could be even nature saying that first line. Our Father who art in heaven, the trees could say that. The blades of grass could say that. The streams, the sun, the breeze. St. Francis would be so proud if he were to hear us talking about how nature could pray that first line just as much as we could. The our is very inclusive. Our Father in heaven. So it's communal. Father, that would mean that the prayer should be familial. Yes, it's to God, but there's a certain type of relationship that's supposed to be very unique and very intimate and very tender. That's not the same thing as the Greek gods of the old. Does that make sense? So it's communal, it's familial. Our Father who, it's a person. We've got to recognize God is not just some impersonal force in the cosmos. God is actually a person. Okay, that's interesting. So it's communal, familial, it's personal, it's a statement about God is certainly there. In would include that God means that God can be in places. That might sound redundant, but what does it mean to say that God dwells in places? And especially in the New Testament, when we start to say the kingdom of heaven is inside of us, and God dwells inside the kingdom of heaven. You're like, this is very interesting. When we say, our Father who is in heaven, sometimes we have this understanding that heaven is elsewhere and not also here. When in reality, the part of the New Testament is that Jesus comes to preach the good news of the kingdom. And the kingdom of heaven is already popping up in places here, now. A lot of us actually have an understanding that heaven is completely elsewhere. When actually that's not exactly Christian. Because that's actually more of like a Plato understanding that here's the physical, elsewhere is the spiritual, and that's where God lives, and God doesn't touch the physical. But the incarnation says very different. God actually is happy to dwell in the physical. Now, one of the most striking things about the Lord's Prayer is that it's the Lord's Prayer. It's not our prayer. Now, don't run off. I understand that might have been offensive to some of you, but what does it look like for you to write your prayer? This is the Lord's Prayer, and that's fine, and I'm not trying to diminish that in any sense or capacity, but there's something to be said that all of us have to find our way of praying. And there's this ancient wisdom that says, don't pray as you can't. So if you're trying to pray and you can't do it, then that means that mode of prayer isn't good for you and your personality. And don't add guilt or anger upon yourself because you can't pray like how somebody else might. And so what we have sometimes in Christian circles is a mandate of how to pray, and then if you can't do that, you feel like you're a terrible Christian, or you have this heaped up double anxiousness or guilt because you can't pray like somebody else would. And prayer is not supposed to be something that adds guilt onto you. It shouldn't be something that feels like a mountain in that sense. So whatever you think of prayer, let your understanding of prayer be something that's personal, but let it be something that breaks open your heart and your soul and your mind to everything. So here's my challenge to you, is as we go through the Lord's Prayer in this upcoming series, we're going to do a line at a time. We're going to break it down. I would love to see what you come up with if you were to write your own personal paraphrase of each line, so that you take the Lord's Prayer seriously, but that you use it to find a way to personally say your prayer. Does that make sense? And maybe by the end of this, we could have a really cool project where everybody puts up their own personal paraphrase of the Lord's Prayer. I don't know about you, but that sounds very interesting to me. Because just like last week, a lot of us bring our masks to church. And prayer is supposed to be a private and intimate thing, but it can be also one of the ways that we learn to take off our masks and bring forth our true selves to one another. So maybe at the end of this series, like I said, let's gather all of these paraphrases of the Lord's Prayer. And maybe in the midst of this upcoming series, you'll find the way that you can pray. And you'll find a way to pray in a communal way, in a familial way, in a way that recognizes God as a person, that recognizes that God exists, and that recognizes that there is even such a thing as heaven, and that heaven can exist here on this earth now through you. You are all incredibly wonderful, just delightful, and I hope and pray that this is helpful for you. So have a wonderful day, have a great Sunday, and may grace and peace be with you.